4 simple steps that are simple but not easy to follow through on that you can use to become a top level security researcher. Now, my only promise to you is that these are simple steps, that they're not actually easy to follow through on. So it's up to you to go and execute on these 4 steps and actually be able to reach that top rank of, whatever you would consider to be an elite security researcher. But of course, before we dive into these 4 steps, my name is Owen, and almost 2 years ago, I founded Guardian Audits. And at this point, we've uncovered hundreds of critical and high vulnerabilities across hundreds of different smart contracts and dozens of security reviews. And I've personally spent easily over 1,000 hours, perhaps even over 2,000 hours at this point, auditing smart contracts. And my goal with all of these videos, and especially this one, is to distill down everything that I've learned from all of those hours spent and give them to you so that you can ultimately become a much better blockchain developer, security researcher, whatever you're looking to be in a fraction of the time. So without further ado, let's dive into these 4 simple but not easy steps. All right, fantastic. So we're going to cover these 4 simple things, and like I said, they'll be by no means easy, but I can promise you that if you commit to them and you invest an unreasonable amount of time into these 4 simple things, then I can promise you that you will see results and you will see yourself starting to pull away from every other, aspiring smart contract security researcher. But that has a big if attached to it. If you can commit, and if you do it with an unreasonable amount of effort for an unreasonable amount of time, then you will see results. And just to give you context, personally, it took me probably at least 6 months, and I hope that you can do this a lot faster than I did now that, there's a lot more resources and you have videos like this and other videos that I put out. I hope you can do it a lot quicker than I can, and of course that's the goal of this channel. But it took me at least probably 6 months before I started to feel like I had somewhat of a handle on security reviews, or audits as they were referred to commonly back then. And then even after the first year, I think we only had probably a little bit of momentum built up. It was nothing crazy. So I think setting the right expectations and understanding that it takes time, but as more time passes, you get further along and you can just keep moving in that forward direction, right? It's not a linear formula. It is very much quadratic or exponential, even in the sense that every day you're building on every day prior. So even after a year for me, I just was starting to hit that, that hockey stick of the curve. And now 2 years in, after doing this for, around 2 years now, it's just getting easier and easier. So really sticking to it for an unreasonable amount of time is the key ingredient. And I would add that, all of these steps, none of them matter without the key factor of time. So keep that in mind as we're going through each of these 4 steps here. All right, so let's not waste any more time and let's get started with number 1 here, which is to write a lot of Solidity. So lots of people want to jump straight into auditing, and that's great. Auditing is, sometimes it can be really fun, and, you see the big numbers getting paid out in Code Arena contests and the big numbers that Pashov is doing and tweeting out. But a lot of people want to just dive in and they want to start doing that. I want to do that right now. You don't want to start off by just doing that, and I'll tell you why. When you skip over the whole rocky cutscene of actually writing Solidity code and designing smart contracts yourself, you're skipping over a lot of intuition that you could be building for, what does a really well-designed smart contract look like? Only after you build up that intuition by writing a lot of smart contracts yourself and having to deal with this design ideation and process, will you be able to then look at other code bases and see exactly where they maybe have some pitfalls in their design, or where something is a little weird in this area of the code base. It could have been done, much simpler. Usually that's where the bugs lie. And you won't be able to zero in on those exact pieces of a code base unless you've built up that intuition, that sixth sense, or as I like to call them, code smells, that you can just detect and automatically zero in and say, hey, something's not right here, and I think there's a bug here. Or perhaps you are able to recognize something that is probably a bug because it's a mistake that you've made in the past when you were creating a smart contract system. So let's have a quick story time. Actually, when I was building my first DeFi protocol, I got wrecked, okay? I made a common sin when it comes to designing smart contracts, which is to have parallel data structures. I think what we had is we had a mapping of address to like a request struct, and then we also had a list of all of these, different request structs that were supposedly in the mapping. And so we had a list and a mapping, and they were both sort of pointing to the same pieces of data. Well, long story short, of course, the list and the mapping got out of sync, and we had a critical bug where users could not withdraw their funds. Now, thankfully, we were able to save those funds and recover them, send them back to users, but it burned into my memory this idea that anytime you see parallel data structures, two different storage variables basically tracking the same piece of state just in different ways, alarm bells should go off in your head. And I'll never forget this now. And now I've probably found a decent amount of high and critical findings because of this. So you want to take the time of actually putting in the work, writing your own smart contracts to build up your design acumen so that you can spot these things from a mile away. So how do we do this? So just start off by literally writing your own DeFi protocols. This will also help you just understand DeFi in general, which is going to be hugely, hugely beneficial. So go and try and implement a lending and borrowing protocol. Go try to implement perpetuals or maybe an optimizer vault, and take inspiration from some of the leading code bases of this DeFi archetype. Then and only then, when you go and you actually try to implement these, will you start to find the actual niche issues with each of these types of code bases when you go and implement them yourself and start to run into these issues and have to sit back and think about the design first. All right, number 2 here is we want to read and understand code bases. So really what I mean by this is we want to flex that muscle of being able to read and understand code bases extremely quickly and at a really deep level. The faster and the deeper that you're able to go, the more interesting exploits you'll be able to uncover, and the more exploits you'll be able to uncover in general. So get your hands on as many code bases as you can possibly imagine and just devour them. Try to understand what a normal user interaction will look like, how that will flow in each of the functions in all the smart contracts. Try to understand what the purpose of each function is, and even try to understand, the nitty-gritty of why did they structure, why did they do this line like they did? Or maybe why didn't they have this function just, do all this logic just right here or something like this. You want to get exceptionally good at this because this is probably 95% of what manual analysis is. Any bug or vulnerability that's worth anything in an audit contest or worth any street cred on Twitter has to do with the nitty-gritty details of a specific protocol. So you want to master the ability to understand the nitty-gritty. And of course, you do that by practicing over and over, training that muscle, opening a new code base, trying to get to a high-level understanding as quickly as possible, and trying to understand the intimate details of the implementation. Matter of fact, not even looking for bugs and vulnerabilities when you do this, or even thinking within that context, but just going strictly for understanding. Okay, and then thirdly, now we can actually move on to the security specific side of things, and we can start learning specific vulnerability classes and bug classes. So once we've built our base of smart contract design acumen, and then now we have a really strong ability to open a new code base fresh and understand it quickly and get to understand the intimate details of it. Now we lay on top of that the ability of just sheer knowledge of different types of exploits and different types of bugs that commonly come up. Now you have a trifecta. You have all of the actual base skills that you need to put these together and become an elite level auditor specializing in manual analysis. And so now it's time to master all of these things. It's time to understand all the different types of reentrancy. It's time to understand DOS attacks. It's time to understand flash loans. It's time to understand gas griefing. It's time to understand front running, Oracle manipulation. The list goes on and on. And so this is exactly how we build our toolbox. Our toolbox is what we reach into as we're reading a code base. You see that line that makes an external call and you have a question. You have a question about gas griefing. You have a question about DOS attacks. You have a question about reentrancy. You leave a note there and you come back to it later. This is where we use the tools in our toolbox. And the more tools you have, the more stuff you can throw at the code base and the more interesting findings you'll come away with. But don't get this confused with just straight up pattern matching. I think a lot of security researchers are trying to just take findings that they see in different reports and just copy pasta them and see if they stick, just throwing a bunch of findings and seeing what sticks to the current code base. But that is not how you should be using these tools. You don't want to just pick up a wrench or a hammer and just throw it at the nail. You want to pick up the hammer and use the hammer like it's supposed to be used and hit the nail. So take this idea of service attacks and apply it specifically, see how it can be applied in an interesting, novel way to the code base. Security review is not even close to just memorization of findings. If that were true, then ChatGPT would already be doing it. It is the specific ability of taking that intimate knowledge of the code base and combining it with these tools in your sort of like hacker's toolbox to be able to come up with something interesting that yields an unexpected behavior that potentially causes significant damage. So how do we effectively build up our toolbox? Of course, you can go the classic reading reports route. So go and study from the auditors before you read reports from some of the top auditors, solo auditors, or even firms. See what the commonalities are between similar findings, and then go a step beyond and actually go ahead and look at the line numbers that the findings are referring to. Then go and open that code base, look at those line numbers, and read and understand the code base until you understand exactly why that finding was valid, and then following that, exactly why that finding was ranked at the particular severity level that it was ranked at. And then when you understand those two things, you'll have fully understood the finding. Okay, so yes, reading reports is valuable, but there is diminishing marginal returns for every additional report that you read. You don't want to just spend, months of just reading reports and studying and preparing to audit. Instead, you want to jump into the fourth thing here, which is just to simply audit like crazy. So once you've read your first handful of reports and you start to build up a really solid working understanding of the fundamental types of vulnerabilities and bug classes, and you've built up your toolbox, now it's time to just go all out, dive right in, and just get into an audit. Now, to be honest, I didn't actually spend that much time reading reports before I just straight up got into auditing. And then once I did, I didn't look up until I had gotten 1,000 hours of auditing under my belt. And then when I did, well, it was already, not bad at auditing. So yes, of course, it's going to be hard at first. You might jump into your first contest and get overwhelmed at the size of the code base. So maybe when you jump into your first contest, try a smaller code base, of course. Then once you can handle that, move on to something a little bit more complicated where there can be, more bugs and more interesting bugs. And then you also grow your capacity to work with larger code bases. Then if you ever do move back to a smaller one, it's easy peasy. But when you're first starting out, it's going to feel like an uphill battle. And you might even think that you suck at it. Well, of course you do. You've literally just started. Of course you suck at it, right? But this is temporary, and it has nothing to do with who you actually are or what your identity is. You just haven't done it before. So when you first, got on a bicycle, you probably couldn't just automatically ride a bike, right? You had to spend, maybe at least an hour doing it until you're like, okay, I can now ride a bike. Now, auditing is a lot harder than riding a bike. So give yourself some leeway and understand that it's going to be hard for that learning phase, and it's going to take a lot of effort before it becomes effortless. And then it is just as easy as riding a bike. So after your first 100 hours, you'll suck a little bit less. And then even less after your first 200 hours. After your first 500 hours, you might be okay. After 700 hours, you're starting to get good. And then after 1,000 hours, you've gotten the handle of this and the momentum is already carrying you. And so to put things in perspective, 1,000 hours is 5 hours a day for 200 days. Now, even for, some really dedicated folks, that will probably take around a year. So set your expectations accordingly. The most important thing is that you stick to it, because literally nothing happens within a number of weeks. But after your first 6 months, you'll have a bit of experience under your belt. And then after your first year, you'll have some momentum. And now 2 years in, like I said, things are just getting easier and easier for me. And so, of course, stick with it and know that today you're building on every day prior. That is all I have to talk about today. I hope that some of this could be useful to you. And again, I hope that you can take these 4 steps and actually execute on them and do the hard part of putting in an unreasonable amount of effort for an unreasonable amount of time. And of course, if you are a part of a team that is building a cool new DeFi protocol and you're starting to think about security reviews, then I want to hear about your project. In fact, I want to hear about it so much that if you go to guardianaudits.com/quote, then I'll have a complete list of initial security notes for your specific code base that you ought to look into, consider fixing some of these things before you go into a smart contract security review. And of course, if you happen to know any teams looking for a smart contract security review, send them to guardianaudits.com/quote. And if you're looking to join a community of smart contract auditors and security researchers from around the world and share your experience and learn from others, then go ahead and submit an application to join our free community at lab.guardianaudits.com. All right, fantastic. I can't wait to see you in the next one.